All right, why don't I go ahead and start with our introduction? Um, we're so pleased to have Rachana Pave be our guest speaker today. She is the Equitable Assessment Specialist at the Center for Teaching and Learning. She earned her PhD from the University of Virginia in Animal Behavior and Evolution. She was born and raised in India and completed a dual bachelor's and master's of science degree in science at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research. Drawing from her own experiences of being an international student, educator, and scientist, she advocates for teaching practices that create an equitable, inclusive, and transformative experience for all learners. Welcome, Dr. Pave.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, for this opportunity. And I'm really glad to be sharing this presentation and what I have learned in the course of my work at the CTL with our audience here. Would you like me to just start sharing the slideshow and get started? Is that okay?
Why don't you go ahead and share your screen? Yeah.
Let's see. Are you all able to see the screen? Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and welcome to this session. As Kirsty mentioned, my background is in science and doing a PhD in science. And I primarily work on assessments and providing assessment support to faculty through course design, assessment design at the Center for Teaching and Learning. However, given the exit of our past inclusive pedagogy lead, Dr. Cortez Scott, I ended up taking on a lot of the work that he was doing. And so I must thank Dr. Scott because this presentation is kind of adapted from the work he has done with respect to educating folks on addressing microaggressions, particularly in classroom contexts. So you'll notice that a lot of the examples that I do provide are very much in context where in the classroom where there are these hierarchies between the faculty and the student. However, a lot of the strategies that we will talk about in terms of addressing those microaggressions are applicable in a lot of contexts. So I hope you can get as much as possible out of this session. I do want to note that this session is primarily targeted for folks who have either experienced microaggressions or witnessed them and want to learn more about being an effective bystander. However, if you're someone who has in the past maybe unintentionally impacted someone by committing a microaggression, I invite you to attend our second session, which is scheduled for November 5th, and probably leave this space unless, of course, like you're welcome to stay, but know that most of those strategies on how to address microaggressions when you're committing it will be dealt in on November 5th. I did want to start off with a few learning agreements. Unfortunately, we have a very short time. We have only 25 more minutes or 30 minutes with each other. So I may not have a lot of time to do this together or co-create these learning agreements, but I hope that we all can be open and honest, not only with each other, but with ourselves. We do believe that authenticity promotes experiential learning. Secondly, when sharing experiences, I encourage you to use I and or we statements, primarily to kind of center yourself and your experience, since it can be difficult to generalize what maybe all Asian American people feel or what all Indian people feel and so on. So make sure you're sharing your experiences from a personal perspective. Secondly, when you're invited to contribute to the conversation, do consider sharing the space with others. So if you're asking a question, maybe restrict it to one question given the time that we have, and place your other questions in the chat, giving others an opportunity to speak and contribute as well. And this is very important. In this space, we do not aim to harm. So although that harm may be intentional or unintentional, I invite you to trust the intent of the person, but feel empowered to name the impact. If we've used a term that you think is unacceptable or offensive, or somebody has said something in the chat that you find unacceptable, please feel empowered to name that impact. And then finally, I guess, when somebody is sharing information, especially in shared spaces, do not probe for information that they do not feel comfortable sharing. So if it's a personal experience, please do not ask them for more information about the specific office or specific details that are not relevant to the context that they're sharing. So I invite you to listen, maybe without being too curious of the situation and finding out exact details if the person is not comfortable sharing it, but also try to provide a non-judgmental and empathetic ear to the experiences being shared. I do want to note that the way I've designed this session, at the end, I do want to have a small breakout group activity. I will put the link very quickly in the chat so that you have access to that document. Feel free to take a look at it. I'm sorry, I'm not able to. Okay, here's the chat. Here's the document. And so you'll see the outline of the breakout group activity. I invite you to be as candid as possible. We will not be recording that part of the discussion. However, based on the outlined activity, if you do not wish to participate, I invite you to stay in the main room, ask me questions, I'll be around. And we'll hope to spend at least the last 7 to 8 minutes on that breakout group activity, just to have enough time to share out. It's going to be ambitious given that we have such short time with each other. And if there are any questions in the course of this that come up that we're not able to address, please type it out in the chat. I will make my best effort to respond to those comments and questions moving forward. Now, given microaggressions is, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you may be aware of it, but I do want to start us off by defining certain terms and why this is such a tricky, insidious topic, especially when we deal with in academic contexts. So microaggressions are defined as snubs, slights, insults that are directed towards historically marginalized people, and they implicitly communicate some stereotypical ideas that engender hostility towards people from these communities. Now, microaggressions, the reason why they are called micro is they're often not these overt expressions of discrimination, and therefore can be extremely hard to even figure out whether something that has been said to you is a microaggression or not. And so in order to educate ourselves and best equip ourselves to even address microaggressions, I think it's important to understand what types of microaggressions there are, so that as you're thinking back to your own experiences, consider reflecting on what it is or categorizing as to what it is that you may have experienced. I'll try to give some examples as we go along. So the first type of microaggression that's often defined is a microassault, which is a form of very overt prejudice, stereotyping, or discrimination that is intentional and hurtful, but is expressed in a garb to mean that it is a joke or it's not as serious as we believe it is. Having said that, these are definitely very overt expressions of prejudice and discrimination. So it could be somebody touching your hair without permission, or even with permission. I find that super offensive. Or maybe, saying a statement and then clarifying, oh, but I was just joking, you took it too seriously, while being explicitly prejudiced and stereotyping in that moment. Micro insults, on the other hand, are more subtle messages of rudeness, insensitivity expressed through verbal or nonverbal statements regarding a person's identity. So this could include saying someone, oh, who's actually in charge here? I would like to speak to the person who's in charge here. Or is this really, do you think this is a professional look or so on, when it's clearly targeted to a person belonging to a non-dominant identity who may express themselves differently. On the other hand, micro-invalidations are remarks and actions, whether spoken or unspoken, that undercut or invalidate someone's lived experience, idea, or emotion. And this is very common when someone brings up that they've experienced a microaggression, where they're often invalidated in their experience, and that can just compound the microaggression. So, for example, if an uncomfortable moment is brought up, saying that, oh, this person is too sensitive, or, oh, you are so articulate for XYZ. And that communicates that you don't believe in general certain the kind of validity or identity of a person, and you're attaching a stereotype to that. And then you're making a remark that, if brought up, you're invalidating their remark by saying that, oh, but I meant it as a compliment, and so on. Now, all of these can be forms of abuse, which describe how actions cause distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety, pain, fatigue, and in extreme cases can abet suicide on people. So it is a form of abuse. And what I want to note is that a lot of these microaggressions are really impacted by, not only impacts the individual who's experiencing it, but also reflects on the mental conditioning that people experience, where they've imbibed certain cues through social groups that causes them to be biased in that environment. And so in a way, they are also impacted, even though they are perpetrating that microaggression, that in a way, it's also impacting the way they move around in the world because of these implicit biases or subconscious biases that reflect in their language. And the second thing to remember is oftentimes stereotyping or just this type of information, it's true for everyone, right? We are all, as humans, exposed to certain information or ideas that cause us to create certain assumptions, stereotypes, and personal experiences to represent that of a whole group. And the longer that information is stored in their brain and activated later, we're likely to make statements that we may not intend are harmful, but we end up impacting or creating that harm. So note that everybody can be affected by these biases, but really the strength lies in being able to identify when we've made that mistake, accept it, and address it. But also for the person who is experiencing a microaggression, it can be very hard to even understand or even name it as being a microaggression, because you're often questioning whether what you've experienced or heard, is that really, it sounds hurtful, and you start questioning whether it is hurtful because they can be so subtle. And so if you're thinking back to any experiences you've had present or in the past, I invite you to consider what type of feedback you may have received that you at that point maybe let go as saying, okay, maybe they didn't mean it that way, but that you received in a way that may be rooted in bias. And really the strength with addressing microaggressions really comes down to being able to first identify that that is a microaggression, and then we'll talk about how to address it. Now, regardless of whether these are, whatever we call them, right, microaggressions, whether we call them micro insults, assaults, and so on, because microaggressions are coded, they are so hard to detect, and therefore the impact of it, even though very large, can be really hard to challenge and address. Regardless of what we call them, though, they do perpetuate long-term harm through perpetuating, one, belonging uncertainty amongst people, especially if they belong to marginalized communities. It invalidates their individual presence, ability, and experience. Not only this, it can really compound what is known as stereotype threats. So if somebody is from a community that has been stereotyped or marginalized and impacted in very overt forms of discrimination in the past, they may hold on to this idea of not wanting to meet that negative stereotype, and that a microaggression in a way can compound or make them feel that they're meeting that stereotype and really impact that cognitive load, affecting the ability of someone to be able to be fully present, and can definitely impact their performance in the workplace or in a classroom situation, regardless. Ultimately, these microaggressions signal to people of marginalized identities that they are in a space that they do not belong to. However qualified they may be, these microaggressions are almost like a death by a thousand cuts, where they're constantly their ability, experience, and expertise is undermined by those casual statements that are made. And so, regardless of what we term them, know that microaggressions do have really long lasting effects of trauma that can shut down the person completely and make them disengaged from a workplace. And so, it does have really large impacts, even though the term is called microaggression. Now, what is important to remember in all of this is the power of microaggressions and why they're so insidious and present is that their power lies in their invisibility, right? Because they're so hard to detect and because they may happen so casually over multiple times, we may not feel empowered to even bring it up or address it in the moment. And therefore, the culture or hostile environment kind of perpetuates. And so it's really important for us to feel equipped and empowered as to when we can address these microaggressions if they're directed towards us. But it's also important for someone who may not belong to a marginalized community or to whom those microaggressions may not be directed to be an effective bystander in calling out that behavior. That's the only way to address it. Having said that, we will talk about ways in which when to call it out or when maybe it's more important to take care of oneself and not have to deal with these workplace hostile environment situations. Now, when microaggressions are directed at you, know that when someone harms you, first and foremost, know that your feelings and experiences are valid. Just because it was a statement that was casually made, or somebody questioned, or you yourself maybe questioned your feelings about it, does not make it invalid. I think your feelings and experiences are validated, and it's important to remind yourself that, but also it's important for someone for whom it's brought to attention that they experienced a microaggression to validate that person's feelings and experiences. Secondly, know that you have a right to confront the issue and the person. Just because, again, they got away with the statement and maybe in the moment you didn't confront it, it does not mean that you're not empowered to confront these microaggressions that may have happened in the past. However, remember that you're not obliged to respond to it, and note that you should think about responding to it in your own terms. Primarily, sorry. I was just seeing something in the chat. Okay. Primarily, know that because responding to it, especially when folks belonging to marginalized communities face so much more questions on even their experience, that it can be a very challenging situation to put oneself through. So it's important to note that there are potential risks in confronting someone about the microaggression. Reflect on those potential risks, right? Will confronting the aggressor in this moment or in the future jeopardize your own safety or affect your relationships with your coworkers? However, also think about, if you do not respond, one, will you regret not responding to it? Will you mull over it over time, and will that affect your work? But also, will it convey that this behavior is acceptable? And so know that with even these potential risks, you may decide for in the moment to focus on your own safety, to take care of yourself and not address the microaggression. And that's a perfectly valid response. Do not feel that you need to fight every battle, right? because sometimes these microaggressions can be so many that you almost have to make a decision of when to respond and when to let it go. However, if you do choose to confront it, know that that is valid too. So it's important that you respond to it on your own terms. And there is no right or wrong answer to it. It really depends on the potential risks, but also we'll talk about what bystanders can do in that particular scenario. Having said that, when you're expressing or confronting the microaggression, it is important to trust the intent of the person, because as we mentioned previously, a lot of the times these microaggressions are due to subconscious or implicit bias. So the person may not mean to harm you, but that doesn't mean that the harm didn't happen. And so feel empowered to name the impact of that harm. Know that addressing these microaggressions is often like a muscle, right? You have to kind of sometimes exercise it in order to address it effectively. But at the end of the day, it hinges on being able to take care of yourself first. So being able to find a network or support group of people around you with whom you can discuss this, kind of make sense of the incident and what happened, and then being able to manage your emotions around it, and being able to determine what is it that confronting the microaggression, what is it that you're trying to get out of, and is the space that you are in a place where you are being empowered to speak up, and that your feedback will be taken seriously to prevent future microaggressions from happening. So there are all these considerations that can make it really taxing for a person who's experienced a microaggression in order to direct it. Even so, given all this, if you do decide to intervene and intervene in this particular microaggression, here are some possible ways in which you can intervene, right? One, first and foremost, in that particular situation or in hindsight, you may choose to ask for more information and seek clarification for what you heard. So some ways in which you may want to do this is saying, help me understand what you mean by that, or what you mean by what you said. Can you give me some background on this perspective or this way in which you're addressing the particular statement or person? And then make sure that you're clarifying what you've heard, right? So you can say something along the lines of, I want to make sure I understand your point. By saying this, you think or believe that X, Y, and Z. Those are some ways in which you first want to ask for more information and seek clarification. Now, after having done this, if in that moment you feel like, okay, that was a microaggression, or the person is making an assumption or perpetuating a stereotype, and even if you are kind of unsure, it's most likely that that might be a microaggression, right? In that moment, the way to address it might be using I statements. So inviting someone into a conversation from your perspective. So say there is a situation where in a meeting, you as a woman are primarily asked to take notes all the time, or you are tasked with, I don't know, organizing activities or icebreakers and so on constantly in your work environment. One way to address that is to say, I'm not able to fully participate if I'm always the person taking notes. Can someone else take notes this time? And so in this statement, you're addressing what is your experience of that incident and why it's impacting you. Another way to address microaggressions might be to focus attention on the behavior, statement, and why it's harmful. And this might often be a more effective way of folks then not saying, oh, you are being insensitive or you're being too sensitive or so on. So instead of focusing on your experience of it, focus attention on the problematic behavior. So one example of it may be to say, it is offensive to assume that all Black students on campus are involved in athletics. And then once you've done these statements, or once you've explained your point of view or what you thought was particularly problematic about the statement, consider conveying your desired outcome. So you might say something along the lines of, so now that we've discussed this situation, can we agree to X, Y, and Z? And that X, Y, and Z might be you setting up certain personal boundaries. Maybe you say, can we agree to take turns so that everybody takes notes? Or can we agree to not say X, Y, and Z statement? Or can we agree to respect someone when they're speaking up? And so on. So it is important to figure out what that desired outcome is and what you're trying to get out of this discussion. Secondly, it's not only the onus of the person who is experiencing the microaggression in order to call out or direct attention to a problematic behavior, right? Oftentimes we end up being bystanders to these situations. And so here are some strategies or ways in which one might be able to intervene. So one way to do this is in the moment, interrupting and directing attention to the person and asking them to account for their actions. So statements like, why are you speaking to XYZ person in this way? Or why did you make the assumption? Or how will X feel like a part of the team when you speak to them in this manner, right? So it does involve confronting the person directly in the moment. However, not all of us may feel comfortable confronting someone in the moment. So, in that case, at the very least, what I empower you to do is to interrupt the conversation. Because in that moment, it's really important that the person who's experiencing this harm is either able to leave the space or witnesses that somebody else has also witnessed this problematic interaction and is able to intervene and stop the conversation in the moment. Oftentimes the feelings of invalidation are compounded when somebody is not able to intervene. Alternately, you could also redirect the conversation, right? So if you notice that somebody is being cut off or somebody has said something that is that's devolving the conversation elsewhere and is harmful, you can try to redirect the conversation to say, I believe the point that someone was trying to make got cut off, and name the person, whoever they may be. I would like to hear what they said. And so you invite focus back to the person who was making a point and who got microaggressed on. Secondly, even if you're not able to redirect the conversation, even in the moment, try to check in on the person later on. But if such an incident is brought to your attention, believe the person when they say they have experienced a microaggression. So do not invalidate their experience by trying to justify or defend someone else's actions. Actively validate their presence and value as a person. And finally, consider ways in which the broader unit can be educated and informed to say and do better. I noticed that we're at 12:30, so I'm going to just make sure that these resources are online and present here. So for those experiencing a microaggression, it's really important to find a safe space for yourself. That network could be through the Ombuds office. It could be through a Colorful Women support group. I highly encourage you to check that out if you are a person of color and want a safe space for you to discuss these issues. And then also as a bystander or witness, note that there are other resources to educate yourself, whether it be learning and development resources, dealing with microaggressions as an employee. I found this particular link very useful. And since we're at 12:30, I'm not sure, Kersey, how to proceed with the breakout room activity. I have shared that link with everyone, but I'm not sure whether you want us to do this activity or not.
So Liz does have the breakout rooms ready. There are some people that are saying in the chat that they need to head out. We could just activate the breakout rooms and people can elect to go in there if they want to stay for the discussion. And by the way, everyone, we will not record the breakout rooms. So if you want to have, a really candid discussion, yeah, we will do that. And Beatrice, yes, we have another part to this presentation coming up later. Actually, was it 3 parts, Rashana?
2 parts.
2. Okay, so we have a second part. Look for that coming up. And And I'm seeing a lot of people.
actually, I go out real quick. I put the link to the second one if people want to register. It's in the chat. It's also on our website.
Okay, great. Bridging Intent and Impact on November the 5th. So thanks for doing that, Liz. So it looks like a lot of folks are heading out. Liz, do you want to make the breakout rooms available?
Sure, I'll go ahead and open them now. I'm thinking let's just do, since people are hopping off, we're down to like 20. I'll just do like 5 of them instead of I had 20, and it'll assign people who are still here automatically.
Okay,
Yeah,
sounds
so
good.
thank you so much. And thanks for those who can stay. I really appreciate it, but you're definitely not obliged to stay. What I've listed in this particular case are kind of 3-4 microaggressive statements. And
Thank you so much, Dr. Pave, for being here and presenting to us. And we're very excited to have you back in November for part 2. So please look for that and we'll continue this discussion.
thank you so much, everyone.
Bye, everyone.